Welcome to this Advocate Chat, the impact of patient advocates in high risk, high reward research. I am Wanda Lucas, a 19-year breast cancer survivor, project lead graduate, and current board member for the National Breast Cancer Coalition. It is my honor to introduce the visionary and tenacious president of the National Breast Cancer Coalition, Fran Visco.
Wanda, thank you so very much for that very warm welcome.
You are most welcome. Fran, before we dive into the topic of advocates and research, I'd love for you to introduce the National Breast Cancer Coalition for those who may not be familiar. Can you share NBCC's mission and discuss how NBCC has helped shape what patient advocacy looks like, both in breast cancer and across research more broadly?
Well, yes. So to start with, I want to say that I was diagnosed with breast cancer the first time in 1987. And I was recently diagnosed in March of 2024 with metastatic breast cancer. And I have been a part of the National Breast Cancer Coalition since its inception in 1991. So why did we start the National Breast Cancer Coalition? It was because we were frustrated by what we saw as the lack of progress in breast cancer and the fact that the patient voice, the advocate's voice, was not included. And so we wanted to start a coalition of grassroots organization that would represent the very diverse perspective in breast cancer, bring them together to achieve our mission, which is to end breast cancer. And we're about system change. We're about progress. We're not about incremental steps. We don't do direct services. Many of our member organizations do, but they come together under our umbrella because of our three goals. The first is research, and that is to make certain there's sufficient funding for meaningful breast cancer research. The second is access, that everyone everywhere has access to evidence-based quality care, because we won't end breast cancer unless that happens. And the third equally important goal is influence, that trained and educated breast cancer advocates have a say in all decisions about breast cancer. And how did we make certain we achieved that goal? Well, we did it by creating education and training programs like Project Lead. So we're training individuals to understand the language, the concepts, the process of science, so that when you do get an opportunity to influence, when you do have a seat at the table, you're having a meaningful impact in what is happening around you. So we created this incredible, powerful grassroots network of organizations and individuals across the country that has brought about billions of dollars in federal funding for research, legislation that guarantees access to care to uninsured individuals in certain circumstances, and also made it clear that trained advocates deserve a seat at the research and policy tables. At the heart of NBCC is ensuring that the patient's voice, the advocate's voice, is meaningful, is included, has impact, and cannot be ignored.
Wow, Fran, thank you so much for that answer. I always get full hearing that. So thank you.
You're welcome.
NBCC has always insisted that advocates must be full partners in research, sitting at the table, setting priorities, and making decisions. Lately, many associations and organizations have adopted patient advocacy as a buzzword. How does NBCC define that term?
Well, in the very beginning, when we were pushing for patient advocates being involved as collaborators and partners in science, there was a lot of pushback from the scientific community. I think the scientific community expected advocates to go to the Hill and lobby for more money for them to do their work. And we, of course, understood the importance of that, but we also understood the importance of our having a say in how those funds were spent. So we define patient advocates as, importantly, someone who is part of a patient-led, patient-centered organization, because you have to be responsible and accountable to a constituency. You can't be echoing what the scientists are telling you. And it can't be just about your breast cancer. You have to be influenced by the diversity that is breast cancer in order to be considered an NBCC patient advocates. We believe that you have to have been personally affected in some way by the disease, and maybe most importantly, you have to be trained and educated so that when you do get a seat at the table, you actually know what you're talking about. I mean, this is not just about having a line on your resume or saying, I can go to the Hill with scientists or I can sit at a table and listen to them discuss their work. This is about actually having input into all of that, and in many instances, leading it. So you have to represent others when you're at that table. As I tell all the project lead participants, when you're a trained and educated patient advocate, you deserve a place at the table. But you have to recognize that when you're there, you're representing all of us. And if you don't do it well, that reflects poorly on all of us. So, all of these points that NBCC has developed over the years on how to train, how to educate, who should be at the table, they really are part of a strategic approach to our mission to ending breast cancer.
Okay, Fran, as we set the stage for the San Antonio Breast Cancer Research Symposium, why is it so important for the scientific community to learn about the impact of advocates as collaborators?
Well, I think the scientific community can understand the importance of it if they look at our track record, right? At NBCC's track record. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that during this chat. But one of the things I want to say at this point is that, it's really important that advocates and scientists learn that the advocate voice should be at the table. I mean, we have an experience that they do not have. And of course, there are many scientists who have been diagnosed with breast cancer. That's an important perspective, but it's different from the patient advocate who has no allegiance other than the mission to end breast cancer. And that's an important thing that the scientists can learn is that we have no other agenda. That's all we bring to the table. Our education, our training, and our desire to save lives. And they need us as collaborators in order to make certain that their research is meaningful. I remember when we first started doing this work, and I actually was making a presentation to a group of researchers at a pharmaceutical company. And at the end of the presentation, a couple of them said, "We've never really talked to anybody who had been diagnosed with breast cancer before." It's probably easier to do that nowadays, but back then it wasn't. And so they had a whole different perspective on what it was they were doing. I think we're at the table to tell them, and they have to understand we're there to help. Because again, we share. They want to end breast cancer too. They want to save lives, but that's all we want to do. So we bring a different perspective. It's about relevance, it's about perspective, but it's also about having the ability to ask the difficult questions. We're there to do that. And that isn't always something that scientists do to each other or even ask themselves. But that is another reason why they can learn the importance of having patient advocates as collaborators. And we're going to tell some stories about the impact of that.
Well, that's a good lead into my next question. One of the earliest and most influential examples of NBCC advocates changing research was the Herceptin trial. Can you share what patient advocates contributed and how that changed the trajectory of breast cancer research?
That those are some of my most vivid memories of my advocacy career, being involved in the pivotal trial for trastuzumab, commercial name Herceptin. And I remember, and it's a long story, and I urge everyone to get the book Her Too by Robert Bizzell, and you read more detail about the story. But, back then, the National Breast Cancer Coalition understood, as we do today, the importance of clinical trials. But we wanted to be involved in clinical trials and help move trials along that were meaningful, that would have a significant impact. And we actually created a clinical trials initiative where we laid out the criteria for a clinical trial to test whether we were going to get involved in the trial, because our advocates are incredibly valuable and their time and training is valuable. So what's a meaningful trial? And we laid out criteria, what we expected in our involvement, what we expected from the investigators and the sponsor. And the first opportunity we had was the trastuzumab clinical trial. I won't go into the background of how it happened, but again, you can read the book or email me and I'll tell you. But so once we were involved in the trial, according to our criteria, we were on the steering committee. I sat on the steering committee overseeing that trial. We had an advocate on the data safety monitoring board. We went to all of the investigator meetings. And most importantly, we had input into writing the protocol. And we worked with the company and the investigators throughout the process, interacting with the FDA. Now, once a drug is approved, we're finished. We don't continue to be involved because we're not here to market drugs. We're here to make certain the science happens that really will make a difference. And so, Dennis Slayman, who was the visionary behind Herceptin, we worked with him from the very beginning, and he was very, he embraced the concept of working with advocates and had us involved at every level. And back then, the company said that Herceptin was available to the public 2 years sooner than it would have been had it not been for NBCC.
Thank you, Fran. I always get inspired when I'm reminded of what took place with Herceptin. NBCC led the creation of the Department of Defense Breast Cancer Research Program, BCRP, which has become a model for how patient advocates can shape funding priorities. Can you share that story with us?
As you know, that is a great story.
Yes.
And many people don't even know that the National Breast Cancer Coalition is responsible for the DoD Breast Cancer Research Program. But when we wanted to, one of our goals is research and to make sure there's funding and the right research gets done. And so we had a campaign, 300 million more for breast cancer research in the federal government. At the time, it was 100 million. This was back in 91. And we lobbied the government and educated our advocates about why that was the right number. We had evidence it was. We went to Capitol Hill and we were successful. And that year, the government appropriated 300 million more, over 400 million, from 100 million to over 400 million for peer-reviewed breast cancer research. And half of those funds were in the Department of Defense budget. Again, fascinating, complicated story. I don't have time to tell today, but happy to tell anyone who wants to know. But most importantly, okay, we had the money, but we had a seat at the table. So we have, and we made certain, NBCC made certain that advocates were involved at every level of decision making in the DoD program. So, I and a few others sit on the integration panel of the DoD. We also advocates participate in peer review. That was unheard of in breast cancer back then, but we pushed for that, and it has been very successful. So advocates are involved in peer review. And we also realized that wasn't enough. And so we influenced the mechanisms that the program creates to require the collaboration between scientists and advocates. So if you want to submit a proposal, you have to have advocate collaborators, and that has to be meaningful collaboration. So we have, you know, the Herceptin research was funded in part by DoD, CDK, 4/6 inhibitors in part by DoD. A lot of really progress in breast cancer, such as it is, was really, you can trace it back to DoD and you can trace that back to advocate involvement.
Thanks. Now, Fran, you serve on the TRIO board. For those who may not know, can you define TRIO and describe the role you and other advocates play in shaping decisions there?
Well, TRIO is Translational Research in Oncology, and that is a global clinical trials consortium. And it has a board of directors, and I sit on that board. I'm one of the directors, and it's led by Dennis Slayman. Again, a leader not just in breast cancer research, but also in working with the advocacy community. And the reason why I was interested in participating in TRIO is that, again, we want to be involved in clinical trials that are meaningful, not those that are Me Too or incremental next step. And that is what TRIO was designed to do. It's a global consortium, so you have investigators and advocates around the world who are involved in it. So I get to sit on the board of directors and help set policy for TRIO. But we also have advocates on the scientific advisory committee. We have trained advocates who are part of the committee that determines what to do with, the resources tissue that comes out of the clinical trials. And we partner investigators with advocates around the world on the trials that do move forward. So I'm very proud to be, a member of that board. And again, it's another example of the influence that educated and trained advocates can have.
Fran, it's always my pleasure to engage in a conversation with you. I want to thank you for the insights and the stories you shared today. And I think the lingering question many of you in this chat will have or do have is what advice would you give to new advocates who want to have a meaningful impact at the research table?
Well, of course, you have to be trained and educated. You all know that. And Project Lead is the premier training and education that you can get. But continue your education. I mean, we have Project Lead online. We're constantly educating and engaging those who have been through Project Lead. You need to take advantage of that because just taking a course is not enough. But very importantly, you need to be independent. Who is educating you? Who is training you? Where are you getting your information? Who is setting the agenda? That should be patient advocates. And more I see over the years the scientific community trying to absorb patient advocates into their organizations and institutions and setting the agenda for them. We cannot let that happen. Because in order to be true leaders, in order to really influence in a meaningful way, we need to be independent, maintain that independence, and recognize that we're there to represent the millions of women and men around the world with breast cancer and their families. And we're here to end the disease.
Always, always wonderful. Always, always inspiring. Thank you again for your time, Fran. And I want to offer a special thank you to the Alamo Breast Cancer Foundation for allowing us to have this chat.
I want to say that Alamo was they've been a part of the coalition since the beginning, and they've been amazing partners. And so I am also very grateful to them for including me in this.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.